All right, brother. What were you saying before we clicked on the camera? The jujitsu is going to have to be not paused or reduced. What's happening with it?
Well, I think it's salient to the topic of the day, Pat, where I've been hitting it pretty hard on the old jiu-jitsu the last week and a half because I've been home. It's the longest I've been home for a while. And I've been trying to get in almost daily. And let me tell you, man, it has gotten to the point where I'm like, okay, I think I've burned that candle a little too close to the to the end of the wick. And I've got to back off for just a little bit to recharge the batteries. But life is kind of dictating that for me because I'm heading back out on the road again. So here we are.
Correct me if I'm misremembering this stuff, which happens more and more as the decades pass. But what you just said about jujitsu and working out and kind of modulating between the two,
Yeah.
this could be a different topic, but people might enjoy it because didn't like this question used to come up at like in general level ones or whatnot, and I think if Greg was there, he'd give kind of this answer. Maybe somebody liked cycling, they liked fill in the blank, and they're
Sure.
like, how much can I do before it negatively affects what I'm doing in the gym or on the bike? And I always used to say, I think he gave some sort of answer, again, correct me if I'm wrong, that was kind of like, well, each person's a little bit different. You've got to experiment, how much jujitsu you can tolerate is going to be maybe different than your buddy, and how many workouts you or your buddy can tolerate. And so you're going to have to play this game of finding out, for example, if we're riding a bike, how much time in the saddle, how many miles a week starts to show an actual definite negative effect of what I'm doing in the gym, performance, reps, loading, whatever. And then when you find that equilibrium point, it's just up to you to make a decision as to which do you prioritize. If your heart and soul finds joy on the bike, you might be okay with what happens in the gym kind of taking a back seat and deprioritizing it because you love to pedal, or vice versa. You're like, no, I pedal as a hobby. My gym numbers are really important. Well, okay, if so, then you lean that direction. Am I correct or off in that assessment?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I'll say from a personal anecdotal standpoint too, been doing a lot of jiu-jitsu lately, been really loving it. I'll back up and say, hey, Pat, have you heard the good news about GPP? Because it really does make a big difference. And I'll say that the period that I'm in right now, I think I've been pretty open about my numbers in the gym are not what they have been in the past in any capacity. You pick a domain that you talk about in the CrossFit world, and I'm like, yes, my numbers are a little lower than they used to be. Stamina's down. Absolute strength numbers are way down. You know what I mean? Like total endurance is not amazing. Flexibility even not as good as it used to be because I'm just not really playing that game so much anymore. And I was having this conversation with my wife where I've actually started to pick back up a little bit more CrossFit training on the weekly basis. And I'll tell you, man, the difference is really interesting to watch, and not just in I feel fitter when I'm doing this other activity that I'd like to pursue, but just in the way that I feel I'm moving a little bit sharper, even though the movements that I'm doing in the CrossFit session versus the jiu-jitsu session have little to do with one another. I feel like my timing is better. I feel like I'm just a little bit sharper on the mats. I feel like I'm just a little bit more resilient, and that has nothing to do with like, hey, I did 2 extra CrossFit sessions last week, ergo I'm already fitter. No, I think there's something else going on there that I'm sure you could probably theorize has something to do with that, neurological adaptation coming back around. But at the end of the day, it is really interesting how you get reminded over the course of a lifetime that, GPP does matter and a little can go a long way. And I still don't care that much about my absolute numbers in the gym, but it's that really kind of bright neon sign that says, hey, this still does have a positive influence, even if it's not your full-time pursuit. So anyway, for what that's worth, it's interesting.
100%.
Fun to play around with.
Yeah, I agree. And before we get into the show, I'll do the housekeeping, which I always forget to do, which is thanks to everybody for supporting the show. If you want to help do that, go to variednotrandom.com, check out the cycles that we offer, get your first strict pull-up, which is by far, I think, like the most popular one, that along with the 1.5 mile run. But there's barbell work, there's everything under the sun, from gymnastics to engine to you name it. So check those out. And then if you're a gym owner, any kind of gym in the world, you've got to take care of workout tracking so that people know they're actually moving in the right direction. You got to manage your gym, schedule classes, you got to take care of billing. And now BTWB has all of that in one place, all in one, instead of having to use different platforms for each one of those. So if you are a gym owner, go to btwb.com, check out the all-in-one, and have a blast. So today, we're going to chat intensity, basically everything you ever wanted to know or didn't want to know about intensity. Constantly varied functional movements executed at high intensity is the quick elevator pitch of what CrossFit is. That can, of course, be fleshed out to an hour-long or more discussion in and of itself. And for today's show, the focus is intensity. There was a very small number of words that was chosen to define CrossFit. Intensity is one of them. So what is it? What does it mean? And why is it so darn important? We can kind of start there. And if you want, you can either dive into something if you want, or I, for giggles, took a screenshot of like when I wrote into Google, what does intensity mean, or how to define intensity, like the top 3 or 4 hits as to what it is.
Dude, let's hear it. Let's hear it. What does the Google machine have to say?
The first one from the Mayo Clinic: exercise intensity is a subjective measure of how hard physical activity feels while you're doing it, called your perceived exertion.
Interesting.
Then ACE Fitness, which that was a popular one, I think also with like the NSCA and whatnot. It was largely just characterized as the weight on the bar or the percentage of your 1 rep max. That was the very it's just, if there's more weight, it's more intense. If there's less weight, it's less intense, was the general thing, the amount of weight lifted. So those were generally what I heard. And they're all the other ones I saw were basically variations of one of those two, either perceived exertion or total weight on the bar.
Yeah, it's interesting. On the one hand, I guess it's good that the Mayo Clinic is coming right out and saying that they're not even considering anything objective. So at least it's clear when they're talking about intensity. In my opinion, it's obviously a missed mark, because we know that intensity can be pretty objective and measured pretty easily by just looking at the number of reps that you're doing and how long it takes to do them and how much weight you're moving while you're doing it. Pretty simple things to keep track of, so it can be pretty objective. And then, it's kind of strange that on the ACE side of things, it's like they got it right in a singular domain. It's like, okay, that makes sense. Weight on the bar relative to your max makes sense for an intensity kind of conversation. If that's all you're interested in is 1 rep max and there's no other possible expression of physicality or fitness, it's like, well, why wouldn't you just take that logical next step and look at other ways of expressing fitness and putting some objective measure to them? It's so strange that they try to keep it in that one very specific parameter. So kind of funny, but anyway.
Let me hit you with this. So if that is just a few, and again, not all, but a few ways that different places or organizations define intensity, I'm sure you've got this question more times than you can answer. You're at a seminar, you're discussing what it is, and you say intensity is the independent variable most commonly associated with maximizing the rate of return on favorable adaptation. The CrossFit's definition. Then somebody probably says, "Gotcha, I wrote that down. I see it in the literature." What does that mean? What's your go-to for that?
Yeah, I mean, and this is what we used to go to all the time at the seminars. And I'm glad you didn't put me on the spot there, because it's been 5 or 6 years since I've been in that position. And that line doesn't come quite as readily as it used to, although the concept is still deeply embedded. But I mean, the answer we would give back is like, it is the thing that drives results. And so put into lay terms, and I think more importantly, experiential terms, how hard you're willing to work is going to have a direct result as far as how much you're going to get back from the program. It's just that simple. If I go out and I walk around the block every single day, hey, you know what? That is great. I'm glad that you're getting out there and getting some fresh air and some activity. Awesome job. I'm not going to denigrate that. However, if you're going to tell me that that is intense enough to drive any sort of adaptation after like a really pretty insignificant adaptation period, I'm going to tell you you're out of your mind. There's just no way. It's not nearly enough for the machine, or the organism rather, to be forced into a position that it has to change something, that the physiological change has to occur. So the closer you get to that limit, the more that the organism is going to be, kind of pushed in the direction of whatever physical challenge it is presented with.
I like the fact that you said machine, quite frankly, because
Sure.
if you're talking about, and the other way where I'm going with this is, CrossFit would also say that intensity is power. And
Yeah.
if you're thinking about what power is, and you do the power equations, force times distance divided by time gives you power, average power. Force times distance is just work. And so work divided by time. There's amount of work. How quickly do you do that work? And if you did that mathematical equation for a machine, like not there, you could generate watts, joules, horsepower, whatever it happened to be, and you'd get something there. And I thought one of the genius things that Greg did was kind of looked at human beings as just like you would another machine. He's like, whether
It's
we're
an engineering problem, really.
yeah,
Right?
we're moving a barbell, we're moving a sandbag, we're climbing stairs, we're climbing a wall. Like all of those things are work. We're force, distance, and time. And so if we could calculate work on a machine, why couldn't we take that concept and calculate work for the human body? And hence the power calculation and intensity are what are now applied to exercise and strength and conditioning, which that to me, when I remember first hearing, I was like, that makes a lot of darn sense. I can connect the dots on that one. So I like the fact that you used the term machine there a second ago.
Well, I'll say why I don't like the term machine, just
Okay.
to kind of be a little semantic about it. I think in the framing where you can look at something and say, okay, how much raw power is this thing capable of, and treat it as that engineering problem. Yes, that's the genius of CrossFit in so many ways, is kind of bringing that objectivity to it. I don't like the fact that I use the term machine, because machines don't necessarily adapt, right? Machines are relatively static. I mean, somebody who's more mechanically inclined could
Give him a tune-up,
argue
man.
with me that, well, yeah, sure, you can tune it up, and there's a break-in period where things
Sure,
start
sure.
to seat a little bit better, and they become a little bit more efficient when they're kind of broken in. Fine, but at the end of the day, my motorcycle engine doesn't get better when I run it hard. You know what I mean? A biological organism does have some degree of ability to adapt, and so for that reason, I think it is an important distinction that, you use that kind of machine-like mentality to look at the objective nature of how efficient you are, how much you're capable of, what does that look like over an extended period of time, not just meaning a single session, but week to week, month to month, year to year. However, to go back to my walking analogy, any organism needs to experience a certain degree of a stressor before there is a response to that stressor. And so that's where intensity as a driver of progress becomes really significant.
What I also liked about how CrossFit defined intensity, compared to when we just read whatever it was from the Mayo Clinic or another organization, because like we said, it's not like they nailed it for the barbell stuff, but not much else. Is CrossFit's definition took into account this mixed modality, different elements. It's not just a 1 rep max. I'm going to do 3 rounds for time of a 400-meter run, 15 thrusters at 135. And if I do that workout a second time with the exact same weight on the bar, well, I didn't change the barbell weight. But if I do it faster, even though the barbell weight didn't change, the time it took me to do that work is decreased. If that time has decreased, my power intensity has increased. And that, I think, helped, I don't know, I should say solve a problem, but cover what I would say is a hole in some of the other, one of many holes in the other definitions. So I kind of liked that coverage as well.
I do too, and I think it puts I'm so big about the individual being empowered to take some of these basic fitness literacy elements and be able to apply them on their own. And I feel the same way about nutrition, basic movements, even really basic coaching. Like, everybody has the capability, maybe not the interest, but the capability to learn enough about these things that they can take it and apply the 80%, right? That being said, I feel like there's so much bait and switch in the fitness industry. For example, you look at some of these.
The fitness industry?
I know, right? Yeah, shocker. But if you take a look at some of these other approaches, and where people are going to look at something like an individual's running capacity, they're going to try to bait and switch you to believe that something like a VO2 max or the heart rate that you're sustaining, those are the real metrics to focus on. Instead of hey man, I couldn't run a mile at all when I first started. Now I can run a 12-minute mile. A couple months from now, it's going to be a 10-minute mile. And maybe over the course of my entire fitness career, it's going to be a 6-minute mile. Very significant improvement, very easy for an individual to just go out there and time it and see that progress. There's no mechanism beyond that that's necessary. But no, you're going to be convinced that like what I really need to be tracking is my VO2 max or some other thing that requires a pretty difficult measurement process to be able to see any sort of result. And it's this weird trick that people begin putting more stock in those types of metrics rather than what's right in front of you, and that you have an easy opportunity to just sit down and like take a look day over day, week over week, month over month.
And that reminds me of a point I wanted to say when I mentioned the 3 rounds for time with the 15 thrusters and the weight on the bar didn't change, but you do it a minute faster. Not only did that cover another one of the issues in intensity that some of those other definitions don't, but it's so darn simple, and it is an elegant solution, as Greg said. It's beautiful because you can make these broad sweeping generalizations that without anything other than your stopwatch, things are probably going in a good direction, because I did this workout a minute faster than I did last time. I probably didn't, and since it involves running, I probably didn't put on 25 pounds of excess body fat. Like I probably didn't, like all these other things are probably going right. If I moved that heavy barbell quicker than I did last time and could still suck it up on the runs, well, I must be doing something good with my conditioning and with my 1 rep max and with my muscular stamina and with all by just looking at my watch and saying that it was a minute faster.
You can take it one step further, and this is where I think like the real pragmatic element of it, when you look at somebody who's training, not just when they're young and maybe performance oriented, but over a longer span of time, and you start to really get more invested in this idea of health, right? And again, Greg's original teachings, he used to talk a lot about the sickness, wellness, fitness continuum, and that you could take all these different health metrics, plot them along this continuum, and the goal is ultimately, hey, you want the collection of health markers beyond well, like super well, fit, right? And again, it's like, okay, that's cool, but for the average individual getting blood work done and having access to some of these numbers, it's not going to be something you see every day. Great if you can, but most of us don't. And the kind of the nice part is you kind of don't have to care, because again, if I'm doing what I'm supposed to in the GPP sense, and over the course of a year, my deadlift goes up 20 pounds, my mile time drops by a minute, my Fran time is decreasing, and my 2K row is better than it was, it's almost an impossibility that I'm going to have a greater body fat percentage or a worse blood pressure than when I started. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So when you have this collection of fitness metrics that you're paying attention and can easily pay attention to, it is highly likely, and you don't even have to really establish the causal mechanism there. It doesn't really matter.
It works.
What you're going to find is exactly everything kind of gets dragged in that same direction. And so, yeah, hey, man, some people love that conversation. That's where they want to dig in. They want to figure out where those strings connect and how that mechanism actually happens. Awesome. That's really cool. The good news is you don't have to really care about that sort of thing to still reap the same benefit. And that's the cool part, in my opinion.
100%. You can tell that things are going in the right direction, and and intensity is so critical, like you said, to drive adaptation, to drive results. And that original definition, which I didn't put you on the spot for, of, I'll say it again, independent variable most commonly associated with maximizing the rate of return of favorable adaptation. Then people used to say, well, favorable adaptation, what is it we're trying to maximize? And they would say, well, your fitness. You're trying to, your ability to do functional movements and to do them quickly, to aka, produce power and intensity over broad time modal domains. And so we're interested in results, and intensity seems to be critically linked to driving those results in a positive direction. And, in simple terms, we're just saying, like, you got to work hard. Like you talked about with the walking example, you've got to try hard. You've got to push yourself. You have to exert yourself. You have to get uncomfortable in order to stress the system, then allow the system to rest so it comes back fitter, faster, and stronger. You stress it again, and you play this beautiful balancing act over and over again, and things go in a good direction. And if you don't think it's true that you got to work hard and try hard and get uncomfortable, and that just sounds too whatever, just think about, well, okay, could the opposite be true? And I think that's very telling, okay? If you don't think you have to try really hard and exert yourself and get uncomfortable, then think about, well, how's your mile going to be? Here's my goal. Every time I go to the track, I'm going to run a little bit slower than I did the week before. Check back in with me a year later. How's your run going? It hasn't improved. Every time I slide under the barbell to squat, my goal is to put 5% less on the bar. Check back in a year later. Well, it's not going well. Like, you have to try to push and exert and get yourself outside the comfort zone, work hard, because not working hard, it should be very obvious where that goes. And while maybe today this isn't shocking, I think it's important to kind of make a footnote of when this first came out in like 2001, the gym wasn't full of ropes and rings and barbells and, it was full of machines and mirrors and ellipticals, and that was where I was. And, I might have worked hard when I pushed for a set of 10 on the bench press, take a little bit of rest and do it again. But you didn't do these mixed modality, high intensity, then you took a break, your abs were done on a separate time. You do the elliptical for 30 minutes while you watch television or something like that. You weren't outside doing like hardcore foot sprints and things like this, like intensity, like real, like I'm laying on the floor from a workout. Like, that didn't happen back then. So this idea of working out with intensity, which maybe is very, commonplace now, when it first came out, it was a huge change from business as usual.
Yeah, for the public at large, for sure, because I think that, back in the the pre-dawn days, it was mostly reserved for athletes. It's like, oh, well,
yeah, fair.
Athletes train with intensity.
Right,
or like certain populations might train with intensity, but why would the average person want to do that? There's no need to, to really get into that sort of zone.
The average person wouldn't do complicated movements either.
Well, that's the thing, and I'm glad you brought that up. I think that has a big part to do with it. And so kind of two things that I think we need to explore here. Number one, the qualifier high, when we're talking about intensity, high intensity, I think that's where the, so to speak, the number of angels on a pinhead conversation starts to get kind of interesting, where people are like, all right, well, what does that mean, high intensity? So let's pause on that for a second. But to your point, if we're talking about just movement selection, again, we get into that kind of L1 theory. And the reason that so many of these functional movements are designated as functional movements is because they are unique in their ability to express power. And so if you take a look back when intensity wasn't really a thing to the average person, and you look at their movement selections, they're very linked. It is really difficult to have a, quote, high intensity session when you're prioritizing calf raises and bicep curls. Hey, you know what? Yes, I'm sure you can get a mega pump doing, a million different curl variations. And yes, it will be hard. And yes, those muscles will be tired and they will feel sore and all of that. But if we are talking about the systemic, total body intensity experience, it is just not possible with those movements that are typically single joint or single muscle action, because you just can't generate enough power to really get that intensity up there. And so,
and if you think you can, you haven't done some thrusters.
Exactly, right. If you think you can, it's like, well, again, you're mistaking this, localized fatigue pump. I'm not saying it's not difficult.
Correct.
But it is a completely different animal when we're looking at the output and therefore the systemic effect. They're not even in the same ballpark. And I think that, getting back to that idea of like, hey, it's an engineering problem, that's where you can start to see that night and day. It's like, hey, you take
large loads, long distances quickly.
You take the air squat and you look at what you can generate just with that, and you take a calf raise, and you're like, hey, it's a categorically different thing, and it will have therefore a different systemic response. So the movement selection, I think, is something that, up until some of these more high power output movements became more popular, people didn't train with intensity because honestly, they just couldn't. Outside of a couple of things, like maybe you hit it hard on the treadmill or something of that, and you go for a hard run, but that's the extent of it. That was where most people could taste intensity, and then that was it.
Well, that's why one of the defining characteristics of functional movements was their ability to produce power, and hence why they were and that's, well, we could get on I know somebody posted this comment that it brought to my head, and I'm going to say it now. Maybe we do it for a future show, where somebody was like, okay, so if that's, then why, so you're saying that walking is not a functional movement because it's a low power? So we can do that for another day, but that popped in. Yeah. So, and once we get to where we are now, then people will also hear like, mechanics, consistency, intensity, like there's a roadmap for this that's been laid out and works very well. after defining intensity and chatting about it like we did, you'll then probably hear the next part, which is, okay, intensity, you could be talking mathematical intensity or you could be talking relative intensity. And, you know, I'll chat, you know, what I think is a good example of mathematical, then maybe you can say whatever you would normally say for relative. So,
yeah.
And the two coexist in the same world. Okay, it's crazy. So on mathematical intensity, it's just, think about it this way. We've got two athletes, A and B, they're clones, same height, same weight, same limb length, the whole 9 yards. They're both going to do Fran, 21-59 thrusters and pull-ups, same loading. So from the power equation, it's the same amount of work. It's the same amount of force, and it's the same distance. The work is exactly the same. However, one athlete does it in 3 minutes, one athlete does it in 6 minutes. So the time component is what was different there. One was twice as slow, the other was, half the time. The athlete that did it quicker would have twice the power output, mathematically speaking, than the athlete that did it slower. So that is intensity if we're just looking at it from the engineering machine equation standpoint. But we're human beings, like you said. So there's also a relative aspect to intensity. And when people would ask, what is relative intensity? What does it mean? How does it relate to what I do every day? Did you have a go-to for that?
Yeah, sure. And it's as simple as extending the metaphor that you've kind of got, or the example that you've already got laid out there. So you have these two athletes. Let's say they're twins.
Yes, and right? I'm sorry, I meant to say that they both gave their all.
Yeah, perfect. So they're twins, and you have one with the 3-minute time, one with the 6-minute time. Of course, you look at the 3-minute time and you say, objectively, this was more powerful. Therefore, it was a much better session. That could be an easy conclusion to draw, but you don't know the whole story. What you need to know is, what does that result stack up like against their absolute best? Mm-hmm. And so, for example, training age and ability at current are going to be something that needs to be considered. So maybe you have these twins, but athlete A, the fast athlete, he's been training for a decade already. And athlete B is just getting started, something like that. And so let's say athlete A, he turned in a 3-minute time, objectively much better than his 6-minute brother. But his best ever was actually like a 145. Well, now when we start looking at it in those terms, we're like, actually, relative to what he is capable of, he kind of took it easy.
Kind of sandbagged it.
Even though it was a much better result, quote unquote, on paper
right.
to his slower brother, compared to his best, you're like, it's actually maybe not as intense as I thought it was. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, let's say your brother, the slow brother, quote unquote, that's a PR. The last time he did this same workout, he did it a minute slower. And so now he has exceeded his previous best, and his intensity has never been this high. That's a big win. And in fact, his relative intensity, based on what we know about that athlete, is actually higher. And so it just shows that, sometimes when you get really drilled in on trying to, force your perspective through just the singular definition, it can lead you to draw conclusions that don't take in the larger picture. Mm-hmm. And that larger picture is what leads you to this conversation around, hey, we have to think in relative terms here. Okay, just because somebody was faster than you today doesn't mean anything if we don't know much more about the bigger picture.
Yes, and well said. Another thing we'd say is, relative intensity, that's a relative to what? Relative to the individuals, that's a physical and psychological tolerances, which is exactly encapsulated by what you just said right there. So if you've got this mathematical intensity, you've got relative intensity, you've got high intensity and whatnot, then, we can also, but high intensity is critical to driving results forward. What I would also let people know in their fitness journey is, I think high intensity, first of all, let me say unequivocally, high intensity drives adaptation. Okay, it's mission critical. High intensity and the frequency, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, but it begs the question, how high and how often? And
that's, yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Precisely where I was going to go, which is like, I would say high intensity and the frequency with which you work out in that manner. You can probably expect some ebbs and flows during either different seasons of your life, stages of your life, or simply as you age. In seasons of your life could be, you're super busy with work. You're traveling nonstop. You're still a young man, but you're on the road. Sleep is poor. You're in different time zones. Whatever it happens to be, like it could it could make sense that the intensity with which you bring to your workouts would take a hit compared to a set schedule, solid sleep, like everything's good. Or are we talking about intensity and how close you hold your hand to that fire is probably going to be different in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. That's also something else to consider. And so it's a bit of a moving target and not a bit of a one size fits all. But I think what's important for people to realize is the concept. And if you understand the concept and you understand why intensity matters and that intensity drives results, and depending upon where you are in your fitness journey, can you bring the heat 5 or 6 days a week and you're recovering great and you're feeling good and you never dread going into the gym, between the ears is sharp, the numbers are going in the right direction? Or are you later in life and 3 times a week actually is all the sizzle that you need? Or, or is it 2? Or is it whatever? And so there's going to be these ebbs and flows, either because father time has crept in, depending upon what decade of your life you're in, or you're just in some stage that lends itself well to your athletic endeavors or does not. And so taking a step back and being able to apply that to your life and where you are, I think sets you up for long-term success. Like, I don't really care if anyone's a hero in the gym just for a month. We want people doing this for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that term relative changes over time too. Like, to your point, you have somebody who's in their 20s and they're super fit. Again, we take a look at like their objective best. That's likely going to be higher or better than somebody who's in their 50s and their objective best. That's just kind of the way it works. And you can see that through, if you want to look at like competition results in CrossFit, you can see that across the age categories. Older guys aren't lifting as much as the younger guys. They're not quite as quick, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't mean that they're slacking. And it doesn't mean that relative to what they are capable of, that their sessions are easy. I think that's where people can start to make the maybe erroneous jump, right? It's like, okay, you have these 2 athletes working out side by side. Relatively speaking, they are still working at a very similar intensity, even though, again, objectively, just like the 2 brothers examples, you might have one guy that has a much faster or heavier result, et cetera. So,
I remember, and there's, again, intensity is such a, it's everything that we've said, but then there's high intensity that's like, when you think about, like, I hit a workout hard today, like, and I got a solid time or a solid lift. Yeah, that's high intensity. And then there's also those days that are extra special where you lit it up in some way that was even above and beyond. And I remember some old video with Josh Everett.
It's funny. I was thinking exactly probably the same clip.
I want to say he was in his 30s at that time. And I can't remember what event he just did. This guy's a beast. I think he said something like, that he just laid it all out. He's like, man, I'll tell you what, I only got about 4 of those a year these times.
Yes, exactly. That is rung in my head for forever. And like, hey, man, admittedly, sometimes I use it as a cop-out. I'm like, maybe not today. But hey, I think that's true. And at the end of the day, too, I think like recovery becomes more of a factor. I think as much as none of us want to admit it, when you've got more training time in the saddle, it just takes a little longer sometimes to get yourself back to baseline. And so you have to be a little smarter, I think, about probably the volume more than anything that you're training, because I think that tends to have more of an influence on how quickly you can bounce back. Again, if we look at the CrossFit landscape today, I think that what you really have is people that are so addicted to volume that they use that as kind of a crutch, and then they wonder why they can't recover and go hard. You know what I mean? So different topic. Yeah. Again, we can dive into that. But
and I would say people should feel free to experiment, because if I think when I first started doing CrossFit, I think I was 30 years old on the dot, I believe. And at that point in time in my life, my relationship with intensity was full send every day. Burn the boats on the shore, Boz. We are taking no prisoners. Sure. And it worked great. Quite frankly, I was motivated to go into the gym. Everything was going in the right direction. I couldn't say they didn't work bad at all. And so there was a phase in my life that the burn it down every day drove results in a meaningful direction.
Yeah.
Now, some of my hair's gone, and I'm a little bit longer, a little bit older here. And I train 5 days a week now, and now it works for me with regards to intensity, high intensity anyway, is out of those 5 sessions, I would say I always go pretty darn hard 2 out of the 5 sessions a week, and the other 3 I'll allow myself to go lower or moderate intensity session. And doing that for me personally, nobody else has to do what I'm doing. For me personally, that allows me to recover both physically and mentally. So when I walk in on one of those days that I'm going to bring it, I feel ready to bring it. Instead of, if I didn't do that, because I've played with, can I still get away with doing it 5 times a week? And the answer is no. I start to slow down and start to be a bit, not motivated to go into the gym. Things start to go in the wrong direction because I can't bring that intensity because I'm not ready to do it. And so I still get in the gym to get all my movements, get my lifts, get everything done. But for sure, 2 times a week I light it on fire. And if I'm feeling froggy, it could be 3. It could be 3, but 2 I can pretty much count on, and I still get 5 training sessions a week, and that's just people should experiment.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the devil's in the details around the qualifier high. What does it mean to have high intensity? And I think I'll go out there and try to make an absolute statement. People can pick this apart if they want, but
no, they won't.
But no, but I guess here it is. I'll lay it out there and then people can decide what they want. But I'm of the belief, and I think anecdotally I am a product of this statement, that if max intensity is what we're really saying with high intensity, right? So if we're saying maximum intensity, meaning every session has to be a max intensity effort, if max intensity was required for the long-term improvement of your fitness, the program wouldn't work. And I believe I am a product of that, because to counter your statement about, hey, when you were like a younger, kind of running through walls, Pat Sherwood, and every day was game day and like, let's go light it up. I've never been that tough. I don't have the mental tenacity nor the physical interest in running through a wall. And I think that, this probably held me back to some degree if we're making the argument that like, did I ever get as fit as I possibly could have? Maybe not because of that. But on the flip side, man, you know what? I have not been disappointed with my general physicality and the progress that I've made. And, we're looking at 2 decades of CrossFit now, and I've remained lean and strong and skilled and healthy. And it's like, hey, it was clearly high enough to drive something. And so again, I'll reframe that statement. If maximum intensity was required every time I step foot into the gym, well, clearly I wouldn't have reaped the results that I did. And so then the argument becomes, well, how high does it have to be? And that moving target gets trickier to pin down because the circumstances around the individual really start to matter. So, that's where I think people probably could argue,
Sure.
to infinity about what high enough is. But
And
I don't know that I have a good answer, to be honest.
And I think most people are, maybe me or you or somewhere in the middle, right? Like ebbs, flows, good days, bad days, not quite feeling it today, like the whole 9 yards. I'm sore or whatever it happens to be. I think another reason as to why, again, unquestionably intensity drives results, but why I also think it's interesting just to take an assessment of where you are, either in what decade of your life or what phase of your life you're in. You can, busy or hectic, whatever. I think why thinking about intensity and thinking about how your body feels, thinking about how your numbers are going in the right direction, thinking about how frequently you can and can't exert yourself, again, understanding that high intensity drives results, why I think that's meaningful is getting back to like that area under the curve, maximizing my fitness, putting as much strength and stamina, everything in the bank as possible. Well, to do that, you have to be in the game. You can't be sidelined or quit or got burnt out or tweaked yourself or whatever. And I hear so many stories from people that did so much so frequently and now they're out, or CrossFit's dumb, or it doesn't work. And I'm like, man, I think you could have done it a better way and still been in the game, because now you're not really doing anything. And that area under the curve is decreasing with every month that goes by. So I think also all of this conversation is mission critical, because it relates back to that thing that we hammer on all the time, consistency. If this thinking in this way and what makes sense for you keeps you training for the long haul, and then who cares if you were just so amazing for 5 years in your late 20s and then burnt out and you never did it again, versus somebody like you said that did you maybe, let's say you didn't optimize your fitness, but you're pretty darn good and you're still doing it now? I'd take that any day of the week. And so again, I think it's a bit more complicated nuance than that. And even in there are ways that you can modulate this intensity or give yourself or your athletes breaks if you feel that they need it, in either overt ways or sneaky ways. And one of the sneaky ways is actually covered in the level 2 guide. I put it for people under programming, page 53, where it basically says that while we talk about large loads, long distances quickly and all that, every now and then it says less frequently, athletes might need to be exposed to workouts that are a bit more unorthodox. For example, introducing variables that actually decrease power output are extremely beneficial for an individual. And that means if you did put a load in for somebody that's too heavy, that's going to force them to stop and take longer breaks. You put in high repetition movements that may stop, they even mentioned the Turkish get-up, a low-powered movement such as the Turkish get-up, which takes some time to do it. So you could actually construct the workout in a way to slow an athlete down. You put an L-sit in there. I guarantee that's going to slow people down before they do something else. So there's a way to do that, modulating intensity, or consider that from programming. And the other way that I chat about every now and then is you don't have to necessarily do that if you have this, you're authorized in your mind to be like, I'm just not going to go full send today. Like I don't have to put in a Turkish get-up to slow me down, because I know that normally when I do Nancy, this is not my time, by the way. Let's just say I do a 15-minute Nancy. All the overhead squats are unbroken, and I do the runs. They're really uncomfortable and miserable, but I can do it. And they're right at 2 minutes, but they feel like hell. Okay, well today, you know what? I'm going to drop the bar when it gets to 9, shake it out, pick it up, do the last 6 each time, and I'm going to run 2 minutes and 15 seconds per 400 instead of a 2 minute. I didn't change the loading, didn't put in a turkey. Kept the workout the same. And I made a conscious decision that based upon how I feel, like I'm going to get in a training day, I'm going to move the needle, I'm going to go for some runs, I'm going to move some weight, I'm going to get it below parallel, but I'm not going to burn it down today.
And this is where I think it's interesting. If we take it all the way back to the beginning, put a time on that effort. What was it?
That one now it's 17 minutes instead of 15.
Great. Okay, so it took you 17 minutes relative to your best. You're like, that was a lower intensity effort. Okay, fair enough. Perhaps somebody could make the argument that it didn't drive your progress on that day as maximally as it could. Maybe that's fair. But let's go back to the beginning of the conversation. I went out and I took a 17-minute walk around the block. Are those efforts equivalent? Well, absolutely they are not, because no matter what intensity I personally can bring to that 17-minute effort of running and overhead squats, by nature of the movement selection, the intensity that I experienced during that session is way higher than it would be just getting out and walking around the block for 17 minutes. So again, if we look at the relative scale here, that walk around the block is pretty low intensity. It's not really going to drive much. My best effort was 15 minutes. It's, that's the high end. My 17-minute effort is maybe here. It's still high enough that you're probably going to reap quite a bit of benefit from that, even if objectively you're not right at the threshold there. And so that's what I think people can't get too spun up about, is this idea that like, hey, if you're not just blasting it every single day, something bad is going to happen. It's like, dude, the program wouldn't work if that was the requirement. It's just, it would fall apart at some point over time when you can no longer sustain this just like head driving, type of thing. And again, I think we've seen that play out time and time again. I mean, if you want to talk about CrossFit for like the fittest and freakiest and like most headstrong individuals, yeah, man, it is truly impressive with what people can do under those conditions 100%. And with those attributes. But that's not the only person that CrossFit is for. CrossFit is also for the relatively lazy. And I'm not talking about like, hey, they're just not willing to show up and put the work in, but like
I feel attacked.
And yeah, and I'm categorically in this group where it's like, yeah, okay, whatever, man. I'm not as headstrong or care as much about like those times and those numbers and those types of efforts. It's fun once in a while, but like honestly, it's just not where I'm gonna be. Hey, you know what? Call me out for being a little, not as tough as some of the other people. Fine, I don't care. I'm still going to reap a ton of benefit from approaching things in that way, even if you could argue that, well, maybe it's not maximized. I don't care. It's fine. You know what I mean? And I'm going to keep that long game going as long as I can.
And you're still maintaining capacity at functional movements.
Right, exactly. And again, there are more people that are able to engage with it, knowing that, like, look, you don't have to run through the wall every single day. Yes, we're going to expect difficult efforts. That's part of it. There's no question. However, it doesn't mean that you got to be just like lighting yourself on fire every single day.
Well, I tell you what, man, I can't wait to hear you get attacked by the walking community. I really can't.
Bring it on, man. It's fine. I'll jog away at a moderate pace, and it'll
never
be
catch me.
That's right, exactly.
I think that's all I've got on it. I feel pretty good that I didn't leave too many stones unturned. I'm sure I forgot something, but I feel pretty good with that chat.
I do too, and I think that if I could say one thing in these tumultuous times that we're living in, Pat, is that I think these types of topics are really fun to dig into. And I think that there's plenty of meat on the bone. And like programming's the same way, nutrition's the same way, where people really love to dig in and they really love to butt heads about, like, you know, it's 6 grams of almonds versus 10 grams of almonds or whatever, you know, whatever those little micro debates are. But I think it is important to step back at the end of the day and just frame things in terms of, like, look, man, there is a whole industry out there, industries plural, where people are really being sold false truths, where people are really being led down bad paths. And so these internal debates that you know, people like you and I that are involved in CrossFit and these kind of like legit training methods, I think sometimes we got to recognize when it's like, hey, it's fun to debate this stuff, but let's not get distracted by like the sea of bullshit that's out there, and really just remember like who the real adversary is in that context. So for what that's worth.
Well said. Well said. Is that CrossFit Roots in Boulder, the shirt?
Yeah, this is a shout out to Nicole and Eric Christensen.
Fine institution. A fine institution.
This is their 15-year anniversary shirt, so props to them. That's a pretty cool milestone.
Yeah, if you're in Boulder, definitely check them out. So,
yep.
Well, much obliged for your time, Boz. I know you got to get out of here. We actually wrapped up at the perfect time. And of course, thanks to everybody watching or listening. If you've got ideas, if you've got thoughts on this subject, the topic of intensity, where you're at now, where you used to be, the future, whatever it happens to be, throw it in the comments. Go to the btwb YouTube channel, find the show, post it there. We check those out. If you have an idea for a future show, you can leave it there, or you can go on Instagram to the Very Not Random handle, post a public comment. We see those, or you can send a direct message. That all makes its way to us as well. So for Adrian Bosman, I'm Pat Sherwood, and we'll see you next time.